The revolution eats its own. We have seen this throughout history. We've seen it in the 20th century with the communists. We might be seeing it around us today, and we are certainly seeing it in today's book, Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler. You know, in our fast-paced world, it is tough to make reading a priority. At least, it used to be. At Thinkor.org, they summarize the key ideas from new and noteworthy nonfiction to give you access to an entire library of great books in bite-sized form. You can read or listen to hundreds of titles in a matter of minutes, from old classics like Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, to recent bestsellers like Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. If you want, to challenge your perceptions, if you want, let's say, to expand your horizons, I know what you really want. I know, you want to sound smart at cocktail parties. Well, you should go check out Thinkor.org. Thinkr, no E, no time for that, .org. Start a free trial. Put your mind in motion. We will be in motion in the oceanic feeling of darkness at noon, and I will be joined by my guest C. Bradley Thompson, professor of political science at Clemson University, executive director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism, something that the commies in this book really would not have liked very much. Brad, thank you for being here.
Michael, great to be with you.
This is one of my favorite 20th century novels, if not my single favorite 20th century novel. It's so good and so few people read it.
Yeah.
I only read it for the first time maybe a couple years ago. I was so pleased to have the opportunity to read it again. You read it a few years before that.
I did. I read it about 40 years ago, probably around 1980. I was just coming into political maturity, and it was the summer when I read Orwell's 1984 and Koestler's Darkness at Noon. And that was a transformative summer for me, ideologically, politically, and Koestler's novel, I thought, actually was better than 1984.
I do too.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that it has become a kind of forgotten classic. It is something of a period piece, but I do think that it is one of the great novels, certainly one of the great political novels of the 20th century.
Now, before we get into what it means to you, what it means to everybody else, I want to put all of my work onto your shoulders. Can you just tell us briefly what happens in the book?
It's a short, but it's a very complicated book. It's about the arrest, interrogation, confession, trial, conviction, and then ultimate execution of Nikolai Rubashov. Rubashov was an old communist. That is to say, he was a first-generation communist. He fought in the Russian Revolution. He was a commissar in the Bolshevik Party. And the novel tells his recent past. It starts with his arrest, but it immediately goes back to the previous 2 or 3 years when Rubashov starts having his first serious doubts about communism, about the Bolshevik Party, and more particularly about the man known as Number One, right? And the novel is really about the Stalinist trials, the Great Purge of the 1930s, and the Moscow show trials. And Rubashov, the character, is caught up in all of this. And Rubashov is meant by Koestler, I think, to be a kind of a composite portrait of Leon Trotsky and Nikolai Bukharin, two of the great theorists of the Russian Revolution. Rubashov is himself, he is a thinker, he's a philosopher. He is one of the leading theoreticians of communism. So this book is about the autobiography, the intellectual autobiography of an idea. And the idea is Marxism-Leninism and the way it plays out in practice.
And you mentioned Number One. He's the leader of this government. Koestler doesn't mention the Soviets specifically, doesn't mention that it's obviously the Communist Party. He doesn't mention Stalin, he calls him Number One, but that's obviously what it's about.
Sure.
And there are these other characters. There's this ex-secretary of Rubashov, Orlova, who is also his girlfriend, and he betrays her and sells her out to the commies to save his own skin, and she's executed. He's in his prison cell for most of the novel, and he's communicating with people through the walls, through a
Right.
secret sort of code, and they can tap and have conversations,
Right.
speaking to the other condemned people. One is a czarist, one is this monarchist on
Yep.
his side, hates the commies. The other one, he calls him Rip Van Winkle, this kind of kooky old-timer, and they're all communicating throughout. That's the plot. If you know anything about the show trials, you know what happens to these guys in the end. So now that we know what happened, why does this matter so much to you? Why did this have such an effect on your political views?
Well, I was a young man when I read it, and I was coming to political maturity. At the time, I was living in Ontario, Canada, as Canada was transitioning to socialism under the government of Pierre Trudeau. And so the whole country had become very politicized, and I had been, from the time I was probably 14 years old, a proponent of a free society. And I began to see my country was turning to the hard left. And so after my first year of university, I decided to read all these anti-communist novels. And I will say, Darkness at Noon is not quite an anti-communist novel. It's at least not anti-communist in the way that I'm anti-communist. It's a novel about doubt, right? And second questioning. Rubishov's relationship with the Bolshevik Party, with communism and with Marxism. But for me, though, when I read it as an anti-communist novel because Koestler's critique certainly of Stalinism, but I think in many ways of Marxism in general, does point toward a kind of anti-communist position, which at that point in my life was very important.
You want in a novel a reflection of human nature, and sometimes novels are very didactic, and I think that's when they're not very good, and sometimes they just raise these questions of doubt, these questions of eternity, and obviously this would be the case in a novel about the communism, the evils of communism, because the problem there is this misunderstanding of human nature, this attempt to transform human nature.
Right.
And for Rubishov, he's at the end of his life now. He has made this revolution, and now the revolution is coming to eat him, and he's seeing the perils of it. Even in his interrogation, he's interrogated by this guy, Ivanov, who is a former comrade of his. They fought in the Civil War together, and now Rubishov's the prisoner, Ivanov is the interrogator, but then even Ivanov is taken out.
Right.
He ends up being disappeared and ultimately killed by the more harsh, younger generation communist Gletkin, who is now going to brutalize a confession out of Rubishov. And so Rubishov says he's not going to confess to crimes he didn't commit. He did commit certain crimes, by the way. Then he does confess, and then I guess I mentioned at the top this phrase, the oceanic feeling. The whole novel has a bit of an oceanic feeling. There's memories, there are dreams, daydreams. Where is it? I mean, where is the grounding of this novel?
Well, I think the grounding in this novel is actually in a toothache. The toothache is this recurring motif throughout the novel that Rubishov has. And the toothache occurs every time he thinks about those people that he has betrayed, namely the three that you had mentioned. Richard, a young communist, Little Lovey, who then commits suicide, and then his former lover, Orlova, who then is executed by the party. And Rubishov, he betrays them. And he betrays them in the name of an idea, in the name of history. And he begins to start thinking that there has to be something more in life.
I've got to pause you there.
Yeah.
For those not familiar with the Marxist understanding of history, we're not talking about cracking open an old book. We're talking about history with a capital H, the science of history. We know the way toward progress, and when Bill Buckley founds National Review as a conservative, he says, we're going to stand athwart history, yelling stop. Because there is this idol made of history, and you can't let your personal feelings get in the way of that march of progress.
That's right. And history, traditionally understood, is the study of the past. History for the Marxists is really the study of the future. And history for the Marxists becomes a replacement for God. And history is moving toward a predetermined end. And that predetermined end is the ideal communist state. And so Rubashov is trying to understand his own past in relationship to the idea, the core idea that he has spent 40 years of his life promoting, defending, and killing people over, and that is the end point of communism. But then all of a sudden he begins, while he's in prison, for the first time in his life, he begins to have a doubt. And the doubt is connected to what he calls the grammatical fiction. The grammatical fiction refers to the I versus the we. It's the first person singular. Yeah. For the first time in his life, he discovers that there is an I.
Because he had always been speaking with the people or on behalf of the people. We collectively. And
That's
he discovers the I.
He discovers the I. And when he discovers the I, he then begins to realize that he is his own unique individual that stands athwart history, but that individual also has personal relationships with particular individuals, and those relationships actually mean something. So, for instance, in prison, when he's tapping with his next-door neighbor, 402, as he's referred to, his the
monarchist. Yeah.
The monarchist. Rubashov begins that conversation with nothing but utter contempt for 402. Yeah. By the end of the novel, he has a certain degree of sympathy for 402.
He says, "Thank you, you've helped me."
Exactly. Thank you, you've helped me. And furthermore, and I think this is one of the most important moments in the novel, when one of Rubashov's old colleagues, Bogrov, who is also a prisoner, is taken out of his cell, led down the hallway by all the other cells. All of the other political prisoners start drumming, right? And you've got 10 or 15 prisoners who are drumming in a funeral procession for Bogrov. And now, all of a sudden, Rubashov, he feels an association with, an identity with, not only the other communists who are in the jail, but the aristocrats who are in the jail. His next-door neighbor, 402. And I think that is part of this oceanic feeling that Rubashov talks about. It's having a kind of personal, intimate relationship with another human being that stands athwart history and is not subsumed under the we.
And so much of the novel really is spent on this question of how we communicate with one another, the tapping in the cell, the espionage, speaking quietly, looking forward, keeping your mouth, so much of passing notes even.
Right.
And you brought up God and the communist replacement of God. I have to assume Rubashov, being a communist, is an atheist. He's at least officially been an atheist for his whole life.
Correct.
Arthur Koestler, who wrote the novel, former communist, he was disillusioned by Stalin. That's why part of why he wrote the novel. And yet this religious language keeps cropping up, more and more so as the book goes on. A verse from Scripture, an allusion to crucifixion, say.
Right.
And then at the end, this very strange oceanic feeling. I'll read the last lines. "A shapeless figure bent over him. He smelt the fresh leather of the revolver belt. But what insignia did the figure wear on the sleeves and shoulder straps of its uniform? And in whose name did it raise the dark pistol barrel? A second smashing blow hit him on the ear. Then all became quiet. There was the sea again with its sounds. A wave slowly lifted him up. It came from afar and traveled sedately on, a shrug of eternity." Did he become Christian at the end? Did he become religious? What is going on here?
I don't think he becomes religious, but it's important to understand Rubashov compared to Glatkin, his final interrogator, who is a young communist. Rubashov had a life before the revolution. That is to say, he was raised in the old world, a world of religion. And so Rubashov carries into his revolutionary activity the ideas, the manners and mores, and the religious concepts of an older world, right? So when he's in a museum to meet Richard, for instance, who he's about to kick out of the party, they sit in front of a Pieta, right? of Mary holding
the slain Christ.
the slain Christ. And that appears several times throughout the novel. Whereas Gletkin, by contrast, he is a child of the revolution. It is said of him that he is born without an umbilical cord. He has no connection to anything other than the revolution. He's pure logic. And I think what's most interesting about the relationship between Rubashov and Gletkin is that at the beginning of the interrogation, Rubashov has nothing but contempt for Gletkin. Nothing but contempt. Gletkin is a barbarian. He compares a thug. He compares him to an ape. He is uneducated. He's not a literate man. In fact, he's a former peasant. Whereas Rubashov is a highly educated intellectual. What's interesting, however, is that by the end of the final interrogation, Rubashov gives in to Gletkin. He gives in to Gletkin's logic.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the most surprising turnabout in this extraordinary novel, because Rubashov is Gletkin's intellectual superior. But Gletkin is operating within the pure logic of the Marxian view of history, which Rubashov has been defending his entire life, and he can't get outside of it. He can't get outside of Gletkin's logic, which is purer than Rubashov's. It's an extraordinary scene.
And it's a logic that I think undermines logic in that he has to confess to a bunch of lies. I mean, it's interesting your point about the Pieta, this imagery of Mary and Christ, because it enters the novel early on when he sees a guy waiting for bread. And he's saying, this is the image of the Pieta, and it keeps cropping up because Rubashov has a connection to this old world that Gletkin does not. And there's a line, I can't find it now, I should have made a note of it, but it's something to the effect of, perhaps this wasn't a good idea to cut man off from everything he's ever had and ever known and ever believed. Maybe snapping that umbilical cord wasn't the smartest thing to do, because Gletkin has this pure communist logic. But how can pure logic lead you into so many lies, into a world constructed of lies?
Right. And that, I think, is really the ultimate theme of the novel. That is, how is it that the ideal of communism was translated in practice into the genocide of communism? In other words, it's really a novel about the relationship of theory to practice. And Rubashov, throughout the entire novel, believes that the theory is correct. Now, he does, and this is an important part of the novel, he does re-theorize part of the Marxist ideology, but he believes to the end that Marxism as an ideal is correct. The problem that he's trying to solve is, how does this ideal translate into genocide, show trials, and gulags? That's the problem that he's trying to figure out. And what he doesn't consider, and this is why I don't consider this to be a true anti-communist novel, because he never considers the possibility that the ideal is wrong.
Yeah.
Right? That the Marxian ideal is not true.
Yeah.
Which, in my view, it is not true. It's very interesting, Michael, because today, in 21st century America, you even hear some conservatives say,
it drives me crazy.
That the ideal of Marxism is good.
Beautiful on paper.
Yeah, beautiful on paper. It just doesn't work in practice.
Mm-hmm. It's not beautiful on paper.
It's not beautiful on paper. It is an immoral, evil ideal.
Inhuman, yeah, it is.
Right.
Well, one of the great images you have in the novel is Rubashov's understanding of the revolution as attempting to get rid of senseless suffering. And to get rid of senseless suffering, you have a lot of sensible suffering.
Yeah, precisely.
You have this murder, this genocide, this misery, but it's for a purpose at least. At least it makes sense.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. So Marx once wrote that religion is the opiate of the masses. Well, it turns out that Marxism is the opiate of the intellectuals. and I think, and this is where I differ with Koestler. I think the work that needs to be done today is we need to really think seriously and deeply about the Marxian ideal, which I think can be summarized in the classic famous Marxian line from the Critique of the Goethe Plan: from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Now, if you show that line to many, particularly Christian conservatives, they will partly agree with it. They'll say, yes, in theory, that is a noble ideal. In my view, that is an immoral and evil philosophy, right? To suggest that we are going to take from each according to his ability. That is to say, it recognizes that there is an inequality of ability, but we're going to equalize that inability. We're going to, through the coercive force of the state, we are going to take from those who have ability, and we are going to give it to those who have need. But it turns out the concept of need is limitless. It's open-ended, right? And so what you end up having is open-ended and never-ending forced redistribution of wealth. And so I think that rather than talking about the practical, obvious evils of 20th century communism, somewhere between 100 and 120 million dead, we need to be talking about the idea of Marxism, the moral ideal that it presents, and contrast it. For instance, if you contrast that ideal, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, with, say, the first major sentence of the Declaration of Independence: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There it is. There's the choice, America. It's the Marxian ideal versus the ideal of the Declaration of Independence. And you have to make a choice.
And so often the devil is in the details. And so even if one were to take the most charitable read we could of the Marxian motto, you got to define the we. Who is the we that are going to take these things? And what is the, as you say, what is the need? How are we going to define these needs? Something that is striking about the novel, I mean, and regardless if one is a communist, if one is a capitalist, if one is a Christian, if one is whatever that person is, the novel is simply of very high quality. It's of high artistic and literary merit, which is not true of every anti-communist novel. So I would recommend it just on that regard. There's so much subtlety, there's so much nuance. And there's one moment, as the book is becoming more metaphysical, he acknowledges this, Koestler acknowledges this toward the end of the book. He says, something to the effect of, the metaphysical is about to become real at the moment of death. When man is confronted with his own death, all the pie-in-the-sky metaphysical abstractions, they're about to become real. You're about to find out what this is really all about.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. Death has that effect on people. You know, death is obviously the great equalizer. And
you know, Dr. Johnson famously observed that, he said, "Depend upon it, sir, when a man knows he's to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates the mind wonderfully."
Yeah. No, exactly. And it forces Rubashov to really rethink his life, his actions, and his ideas. And he comes away from the experience a fundamentally changed man. Now, it is important to note for your viewers that over the course of the 2 or 3 weeks in which he's first being interrogated and then being tried, his view changes, right? It changes over the course of the novel, and he begins his imprisonment expressing all of his doubts about what the Communist Party has become. But then through his conversations with his jailers, Ivanov and Gletkin, he sort of they pulled him back into the logic of the Marxian view of history. And then it's not until it's clear that he's about to be executed that he realizes, no, there is something more in life than what I've dedicated my life to, and that is one's personal relationships with other human beings.
Even during his interrogation, he starts, he's not eating very much, he's not sleeping very much, he's starting to go in and out of consciousness. So they let him go get a bit of exercise.
Yeah.
And he says, why did I waste my life not enjoying the snow and the breath? Oh,
Yeah.
just to take a little breath of fresh air, how beautiful this is. And it reminds you of ideologues and fanaticists who they spend their lives and I think a lot of people who talk about politics a lot, we have this temptation. We're so focused on these ideas. You're not sensible to the world around you and to these sort of simple pleasures, simple joys, talking to the man
Right.
in the cell next to you, even if he utterly disagrees with you about everything. The little piece of bread that you hold out in the Pieta, the cigarette. The cigarettes play such a role in the novel. Just the taste of the tobacco that he's describing. All these, the feeling of the toothache. And I do want to come back to the toothache, because the toothache is not just a toothache. The toothache is a symbol of
Sure.
his moral conscience. I think I don't quite remember the line, so I could be making this up, but if so, Arthur Koestler, you're welcome. Here's my contribution to your book. He describes a physical connection between the mind and the brain and the tooth. And the tooth is a symbol of his moral conscience. It just keeps gnawing and gnawing at him. He can't get away from that, no matter how much of the logic of history he has.
Yeah, and his whole life was connected to an ideology that had no connection to reality.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, reality strikes him in the face, literally strikes him in the face, and he develops this toothache, which is, you're absolutely right to say, it's his moral conscience, and the toothache only flares up when he realizes and thinks about the injustices that he's done to people that were actually on his side, fellow communists, who did not serve the higher purpose of the party. And what's the higher purpose of the party? It's his own life, right? He regards that his role in the party as superior to these underlings, to these ordinary, everyday, working class communists. I mean, these were the real proletariat. And he sacrificed the real proletariat because he is the intellectual leader of the movement, and he regards himself to be, interestingly enough, superior to the proletariat. So the idea of the dictatorship over the proletariat, of course, that's false. There is no dictatorship of the proletariat. There is the dictatorship of the party, which is meant to represent the proletariat. But in the end, there's not a dictatorship of the party. It's a dictatorship of number one. That is to say, Stalin, right? And the logic inexorably leads to a dictator. Why? Because it turns out human beings, even communists, have different ideas about policy issues. For instance, Bogrov, who is his Rubashov's old friend, who is
condemned man walking down the prison.
who is executed. Why was Bogrov executed? Because he supported big submarines versus small submarines. And so what's the import of big versus small submarines? Big submarines,
They're expensive.
well, they are expensive, but they also have a greater range. That's a metaphor for international communism, for Trotskyism, right? Spreading the revolution worldwide. Small submarines, which number one, that is Stalin supports, are, yes, less expensive, but they're mostly for the defense of the homeland, right? And so one of the other themes that's being played out in the novel is it's the distinction between Stalinism, which is socialism in one country, versus Trotskyism, which is global, worldwide revolution.
And disillusionment, too, in Stalin's pact with Hitler, for instance, where there is this strange similarity between the socialism focused on the nation of the Soviet Union and the socialism focused on the nation of Nazi Germany.
Right.
What is the distinction here? I know they're supposed to be opposites, but they look kind of similar sometimes.
Well, Nazism is National Socialism, with the emphasis, though, has to be on the socialism. And of course, part of the novel is set in Germany. Ultimately, it's set in the Soviet Union. But in the end, I think for Koestler, the distinction between German National Socialism and Soviet National Socialism is a difference not of kind, but a difference of degree.
Yeah. Yes, and I love the euphemism that comes up for what, why is Bogrov being marched down? Why are you in here, comrade? Political divergences.
That's right.
And there are many of them. This is not just true of leftists or Marxists. It's true of conservatives too. You throw 100 conservatives into a room. They agree with one another on 97% of things. They will find the 3% to argue about. And this is certainly true among communists.
And they will fight to the death.
They will fight to the death.
Over the 3%, for sure. It's also important to consider what communism has now become, certainly for number one, and this is now what Rubishov is starting to rebel against. Yeah. It means devotion to the party, and it means 100% devotion to the party. There can be no divergences whatsoever. In fact, not only can there not be differences of policy, but all members of the party have to share the same thoughts.
Yeah.
Right? And so one of the most interesting parts of the novel is when Ivanov tells Rubishov, we must all share the same ideas, and your crime, Rubishov, is that you have dissenting opinions on policy matters, right? And so therefore, and then Gletkin takes over, if you have a dissenting opinion on a policy matter, that by definition means that you are now going to become a counter-revolutionary. Because if you oppose the party on one issue, well, let's take the logic of that opposition to its ultimate conclusion. And the ultimate conclusion is to become a counter-revolutionary. Ergo, you must be executed. and you must die. The single most important virtue for the party is to obey.
And I love this point on following the logic all the way to this end that you think is kind of absurd. How do you get from big and small submarines all the way down to you have to be executed? There's a line in the novel about how maybe some ideas should not be followed to the very, very end and their logical conclusions.
Right. Yeah, and that's the problem. That's the problem that Rubishov has, because Ivanov notes early in the first interrogation, he tells Gletkin, who Gletkin wants to just turn the screws like immediately. He wants to begin torturing him, and Ivanov says, "No, you don't know Rubishov. Rubishov is a thinker, and you have to let him think it through to the end. And if you give him enough time to think it through to the end, he'll come to the right view."
Yeah, the logic will win him over.
The logic, the Marxian logic, will take him to where we want him to be.
Even unto death. I mean, there is this final sort of admission at the end that regardless of all the lies we're putting in your confession, the logic of history demands that you do this. Even though you haven't really committed these crimes, the logic of history demands that you do it. And don't worry, someday maybe people will vindicate you.
Well, that's right. The logic of history demands that you confess to crimes you have not committed.
Yeah.
The logic of history demands that you accept your execution, right? With the hope that one day, in 30, 50, 100 years, you will be rehabilitated by the party.
Yeah.
Right? And we know that happens. We know, right, that from the 1930s that some high-ranking revolutionaries who were either sent to the Gulag or who were executed were rehabilitated. Yeah. What does it mean for the party to rehabilitate somebody that they had executed for being a traitor? Well, what it means is you have new people in power who have new ideas and who view it to be in their interest to rehabilitate certain individuals. The whole thing is a sham. It's a fraud. I mean, there is no consistency of principles. In the end, it's all about power.
Yeah.
It's about the acquisition of power. And I think one of the most interesting parts of the novel is the recognition that that the philosopher behind Marxism, the moral philosopher behind Marxism, is Machiavelli.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, Koestler quotes Machiavelli
He does.
in the book.
Right? And it's the revolutionary ethic is the end justifies the means. Right? And so what is the end? The end is the classless communist state defined by this principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. That's the end. Any means, or by all means necessary, we will do what it takes to achieve that end. No matter who or what you are, no matter what you've done, no matter what your relationship to the party is, we will do anything. And that, of course, includes genocide and gulags.
The first quote in the book that opens up the very book, a quote from Machiavelli from Discorsi: "He who establishes a dictatorship and does not kill Brutus, or he who founds a republic and does not kill the sons of Brutus, will only reign a short time." And you see that power play out. Though there is this ending that I consider to be quite hopeful. There is that sea again with its sounds. There is that metaphysical reality. There is that eternal reality that butts up against even all of the lies. Even at that very moment of death, all these lies that these people have been living in. That comes back again, a sign for an overall bit of a downer, the way things go. There is quite a glimmer of hope, and I think that's true not just in the book, but in the world that we're living in at the moment. C. Bradley Thompson, thank you very much for delving into this. You've been reading the book a little longer than I have, certainly longer, I think, than many of the viewers have. Where can people find you?
I'm at Clemson University, and I have a Substack known as The Redneck Intellectual. And it's at cbradleythompson.substack.com. And that's where I do my weekly writing. And you may have the redneck intellectual over there, but you do not partake of the opiate of the intellectuals. You are not attracted to that Marxism, thankfully. I am not.
Brad, thank you very much for being here. I'm Michael Knowles. We'll see you next time on The Book Club. Happy reading. Thank you so much for watching this episode of The Book Club on PragerU. PragerU is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, so we rely on donations from viewers like you to keep this content on the air. Please consider making a tax-deductible contribution today to help keep this content coming. Thank you very much.